Hi, welcome to Herding Cats, Program Management and Communities. I'm Ben Cotton. I'm the Fedora Program Manager at Red Hat. This is kind of my day job here that I'm going to tell you about. And I just want to be clear, this is herding cats, as in getting the cats to go in the same direction, not herding cats, which is bad and you should not do. Don't hurt the cats. So, if you have nice things to say about the talk, you want to interact, I'm happy to talk with you about it. There's my Twitter handle. I'll be around for Q&A after the talk, etc. If you have not nice things to say, you can just keep them to yourself because nobody is harder on me than I am. All right, so let's get started. What is program management? You might be asking yourself that. Maybe that's why you came to this talk, to learn a little bit about it. And I'm here to answer that as soon as I ask this question. What is project management? Similar? Different? Let's ask. So, the dictionary doesn't really talk about it, but I've come up with a dictionary here for you. Projects have single focused results and a defined end. A project is over at some point, and it's really focused on producing output. Here's a thing that we made, isn't it nice? Okay, we're done. Programs are made up of projects. They are composed of projects, but they don't really have a defined end, and they're really focused on an outcome. World domination, for example. And while things like the Fedora project are called a project, they don't actually have a defined end. And that's just because people who don't understand the distinction between the two came up with the names. And project is a common word in open source communities like the Fedora project, this project, that project, and they're not really projects in this sense, and we're going to be okay with that because words are flexible and they don't have to conform to our very strict interpretation. So, the question I asked, what is project management? So I asked the Project Management Institute, and it seems like the kind of thing that they would know. And they said, the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to project activities to meet the project requirements. That's not helpful. That's not helpful at all. Okay, so I came up with something for you. It's basically working with project teams to balance these constraints: time, cost, scope, quality. If you adjust one, the others are connected and they will have to adjust in some way. A lot of times time, cost, and scope are considered the iron triangle of project management. So you have this triangle, and then like you tie a hot air balloon, that's quality, but apparently quality wasn't in a lot of the early project management literature because I guess it was either taken as an assumed that yes, we're not going to make crap, or that they just didn't care. You can look at the state of the software industry and decide for yourself. But everyone does project management. Some just do it poorly. None of the things in this talk are going to be like particularly new. Like, even if you're not thinking about project management or program management, you're probably doing the activities in some way, or you're failing to do them, which is also a form of doing them. So what is program management? Well, once again, I made the mistake of asking the Project Management Institute, and they said, the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to meet program requirements. Why they took out program activities in this one, I don't know. But, once again, not a helpful answer. So I answered it for you, again. So basically, it's like project management, there's just more of it. And it's at a little bit of a higher level generally, so it's more about coordinating between projects and activities, sort of the intersection, the boundaries between silos, or not silos, if you will. And it's less about involvement in the specific details. Like, you don't necessarily care that on this day this activity happens, and on this day this activity happens if it's all internal to one team. Basically, you want to know when does this thing affect the other parts of the program. Except, turns out when your day job is this thing, and you're just paying a lot of attention to it, you end up sort of volunteering yourself a lot. So even though my job is program manager, there are still some project manager kind of things that I do sometimes because it makes the overall program successful. And there are things that are totally outside the scope of my job that I do, like edit for Fedora Magazine or update websites or all kinds of random things that I sort of pick up here and there because nobody was doing them, and now all of a sudden I'm doing them. Responsibilities accumulate without bound. All right. So what is program management, right? That's why we're here. Let's look at the constraints here. We have time. Time is about managing schedules. And managing the schedule doesn't necessarily mean you set the schedule. So if you're acting as the program manager for your program, your open source community, your project, you're not necessarily the one that sets the schedule, but you're sort of in charge of just knowing where we are in the schedule and knowing where we're supposed to be. And it very much does not mean being held responsible for executing the schedule, because there's only so much you can do. Managing the schedules is building out the schedule, communicating it, updating it, and consulting on schedule-related decisions. So I talked about things being interconnected, and one point I had a conversation with Fedora Release Engineering about, oh, can we move this milestone a little bit because it always conflicts with our conference. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. Here are like 4 different scenarios that we could do, and one of them involves shortening, the time for beta testing. One shortened the amount of time developers had to complete their work. And it turns out there's just a lot of complexities when you move one point in the schedule, because now you're affecting other things that have to be done as dependencies or as downstream activities. And being the one who manages and wrangles the schedule puts you in an ideal position to be able to speak on the impacts of those things. So why would you even have a schedule? Well, users care because they might want to know when this new feature that you're working on or this bug fix that's bothering them is going to come out. They might want to time their upgrades to make sure they have your latest version before they do their thing or whatever. Your downstreams care. So if you're writing a programming language, the Linux distributions that package it up will probably want to know when it's going to be available, desktop environments, stuff like that. If you're, say, a community developed operating system and you have a corporate enterprise operating system that is built from that, they would like to know when you're going to release and when certain activities happen in your schedule. And your upstreams probably don't care, but they might, particularly if you're a major downstream for that upstream. If you're the reason that a lot of people, if that's how they interact with your software, they might want to make sure that they have their release in time to get into your next release, especially for Linux distributions, like a desktop environment or a major package that provides some sort of user interfaces or like database servers or things like that, things that people would want in their distribution. You want to be able to not have to wait till the next distribution rolls around. And there's a little bit of like, how else will you know it's done? Because software will keep adding features until it can read email, and then it'll keep doing more, and it'll slowly just take over the whole world. So if you have a schedule, you can be like, yes, the schedule says we're done today. So there are a couple different types of schedules. These are very broad brushes here. But there is the calendar-based schedule, like Fedora uses. There's a feature-based schedule, which is basically, we'll release when we get this, 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 and this done. And there's sort of a, it's done, I guess, model, which isn't necessarily super helpful, but for small projects, especially with a development team of 1, that's probably fine. You could do worse. So calendar-based schedules, to build those out, you start with the target release date and you work backwards. So if you say, we want to release on February 30th, here's all the activities we need to do to get up to a release and how long those take. And you find out you needed to start work 3 months ago. And you say, uh-oh. You probably have planned ahead a little better than that. So how do you pick that target release date? Well, you might have upstream or downstream release dates that are important. So you look at those schedules and you say, all right, well, we need to have this done by then so we can incorporate that, or our stuff can be incorporated into that release. You might just have tradition. We've always released on January 32nd, so we'll release on January 32nd this time too. You might have conferences or events that are important to the ecosystem you're in, and you'd really like to be able to get up on stage doing your keynote and talk about this great thing that you've just added and it's available, go download it now. But it has to be like available to download, so you want to have it done by then. There might be some fun dates. So like if you're developing stuff around Raspberry Pi, Pi Day is a very popular day because it's Pi Day. It's like right in the name, right? Or you might just say, well, in 8 months, we typically have something that's different enough that we feel justified in calling it a new release. So we'll just release every 8 months because that sounds nice. Or we'll do it once a year because by the time a year rolls around, things will be different enough, and that's a new release then. That's fine. You can also do feature-based schedules. And so with that, you start with your target feature set and you work forward. You say, here's the list of the things we want to do. How long will it take us to do that? Okay. So how do you pick the feature set? Well, how different do you want the next release to be? Like what justifies a new release? If you fix one bug where it's like you had a comma in the wrong place in a GUI menu, does that justify a new release? Probably not. If you've rewritten everything in a whole new language and everything's brand new from scratch, yeah, that probably justifies a new release. So then you think about how interdependent are your changes. If you change A, do you depend on B, C, and D to also get changed for things to work? All right, that should all go together. If everything's just sort of independent and modularized and microservices and all that cool stuff that the kids say these days, then you just kind of pick some, because you might say, well, we don't really want to make it a calendar-based release, but we also don't want to wait 7 years until our next one, because you can't avoid the calendar. Sorry, even with feature-based releases, calendars still exist. And then you can have the it's done, I guess, schedules where you just wake up one morning like, it's release day, I've decided. And like the command line Twitter client that I supposedly still maintain, that's basically how releases work. I'll have some time, I'll sit down and get a few things done, and then I'm like, all right, well, I don't see myself doing anything for a while, so hey, it's a release now. And that's fine if that's what works for you and what works for your user community. So here's some things you want to consider about as you develop a release schedule. You want to think about what milestones you need. Are there deadlines for proposing features or having code complete? Do you have merge windows or branch days where you bring in the changes into the main trunk, or you take the existing branch and you branch off this release so that you can continue doing forward development in the main branch, or however you do it? Do you want to have testing windows where you basically have a freeze and you say the only thing that gets in are fixes for these bugs we find? Do you want to have certain releases like alpha and beta, or do you want to go straight to GA? How far apart should those be? Stuff like that. You want to think about conflicts. So interesting quirk of the Fedora schedule is that it turns out that the mass rebuild always starts around for the odd-numbered releases, it starts around Flock, which is our annual Fedora Contributor Conference. And for the even-numbered releases, it starts around DevConf Check. That's just sort of an accident of the schedule, and it turns out that moving things around just became a little bit of a problem for other reasons. But you want to be aware of if there are conferences that are relevant to your community, that you maybe don't try and get a whole bunch of stuff done during or right after if people are traveling back, as conferences used to be like back in the day. Holidays are important to think about, but holidays are really interesting, especially when you have a mix of paid contributors and volunteer contributors, because your paid contributors will often go off and do something else on holidays because they're not there to work anymore. Your volunteer contributors might actually show up and be doing more stuff because they're not at work, so they have time to work on their hobbies. Your paid contributors sometimes are also volunteer contributors, so they may just keep working the same no matter what happens. So it's interesting when you look at like the Fedora activity, you can see a remarkable drop in activity the last week of December. Red Hat has a holiday shutdown, And people who aren't working for Red Hat are also doing things like traveling to visit family or just spending time with family. And some people are doing stuff to escape their family, whatever. But for the most part, especially with international communities, there's almost always a holiday somewhere going on, and so things just kind of smooth out. But you want to be sure that if you have a really strong contributor core in a certain region and there's a major holiday, then don't plan on having a lot of activity for that. You also want to think about schedule changes. So if you move one date, others get impacted. You're either shortening a window until the next milestone, which might be important, or you're lengthening one, or you're moving up a deadline. And again, this is not a thing where you can't do that, but you want to be considerate of what that actually means for your development cycle. And here's a fun one. Public perception is something to consider when developing a schedule, because not all 1 week slips are created equal. The marketing and the public perception matters whether you like it or not. And so using Fedora as an example again, a while back we decided that we were just going to basically use the same cookie cutter schedule release after release, because it all basically looked the same anyway, so why bother going through the whole approval process every 6 months when it's going to be the same thing. But as part of that, what I did was I decided that the third Tuesday of April and October would be our target release dates, because that made our alternate target the fourth Tuesday. And you're like, okay, if we moved it back 1 week to where alternate target or initial target was the fourth Tuesday, then all of a sudden that 1 week slip moves into May or November. And historically, Fedora has had some problems shipping on time. My predecessor's last release was our first one where we shipped on time, and we haven't broken that since, knock on wood. But we have unfairly now a reputation for being late, and so if we can slip 1 week and still have it be in the same month, that sounds a lot better to people, and it's less public perception. That's reality, folks. So what to do when your schedule is wrong? Well, if it's calendar based, you can cut your troublesome features, or you can slip the release date. If it's feature based, you can again cut your troublesome features. And if it's done, I guess, then the schedule is always right, because it doesn't exist and you just wake up one morning and decide it's release day. But what you say, if I was too pessimistic, and I will tell you to stop lying to me because you're never too pessimistic. In that case, you can release early, you can add more stuff, you can just relax, you can do more testing. Realistically, it's not a problem that comes up very often. All right, so let's talk about cost. Cost is people. Community projects don't really have a budget necessarily. They don't have a lot of dollar costs. I mean, there are costs in keeping things going, but it's not like you're losing out on revenue or whatever. But people, their time is valuable, whether they're doing this on their own time or somebody's paying them to do it. Like, you want to respect the time they put into it. But you don't have control over the people, do you? So your job as the program manager is to help the people coordinate and make sure that we're not running behind because we weren't talking to each other. So communication is key, and you'll see this word a lot more in the rest of the talk. But there's just so much information out there, especially in a large project, say the size of Fedora. So much going on a variety of different mailing lists. So distilling things into highlights helps. Meetings. Meetings, 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 meetings. It turns out meetings can be good. They're not necessarily fun, but they're productive and they advance, work. You can do them via text, via phone, video, whatever works. Think about what works for your community, though, because in some places People don't have the bandwidth available to connect to a video meeting and have it be reliable. People might not be comfortable if your project runs on English and people who are English as a second language or third or fourth, fifth non-native English speakers. They might not be comfortable with their spoken English, but they might be better written. But no matter what format you use, you want to take notes. That's one thing I really like about IRC meetings is there's a bot that takes notes for me. I just give it a couple commands and it does all its thing. It sends out an email. It's great. But you also want to make sure you have an agenda and that you stick to it. It should be clear why you're bothering to have the meeting, and keeping people on track can be hard, but it's important because sometimes things will just go on forever and ever because some people like to talk. The other thing too is to don't let decisions or don't let meetings be the only place decisions get made, because not everyone can attend your meeting. Some people have to work, some people are asleep, some people don't have the bandwidth to join. Decisions are best when they're made asynchronously, and you want to make your synchronous meetings as accessible as possible to your community. But you don't want to shut people out of the decision-making process because they can't join the meeting. So, speaking of channels, I'm a really big fan of having one asynchronous tool and one synchronous tool. So a synchronous tool like a chat, like IRC or Telegram or whatever chat system you want to use. And then one asynchronous tool, so a mailing list or a discussion forum, but not both. Because you really don't want to be splitting the conversation. Well, we talked about that in Telegram, and that in IRC, and that on Matrix, and that was on the mailing list, but that was on the discussion forum. It's hard to keep up. And yeah, you can bridge those things together, and maybe that's a solution for your community. But really having a single place say, this is where we communicate, is going to make life easier for people. You want to keep the barrier to entry low, no matter what tool you use. It's good to have archives. Those are usually your friend. There are times when you need to have private conversations that aren't archived, but the default should be, we're logging this and it's going to be available later. Because not only is that helpful for people who want to learn more about your community to see how it works, or to people who are going to write news articles about your releases or something that can see what's going on, but it's also really helpful to you because I've lost track of the number of times I've had to go back and look at an email thread from 6 months ago and be like, oh yeah, that's why we decided to do that. Okay, I can do this then. The other thing that's really important, I talked about there being a lot of information out there. So moderating a channel for important messages is important. You want something where the assumption is everyone's going to subscribe to this, and if it comes out on this channel, we expect you to read it. The other side of that coin is only the really important stuff is going to get through here, and it's going to be low volume. So for Fedora, we have a development mailing list where lots of discussion happens on a variety of things. And we have an announce mailing list where every message has to be approved, so accidental replies, those go away. Basically, only things that are like big important announcements, you must pay attention to this, goes through there. And that allows people who don't want the deluge of all the messages to still see the important announcements. So let's talk about scope. And scope is really like managing your changes or your features or whatever you want to call them. I'm going to use the word change here mostly because that's the process we have in Fedora. We used to have a features process. The changes process replaced that. It's better. I've given a talk about that. Talk to me about it later. So why have it? Communication, receiving feedback, and then more communication. Like I said, this word comes up a lot. Now the process is going to vary by the size. And when I say size here, I'm not talking about lines of code. That's the number of contributors who are participating. So you want the weight to be proportional to the size. Because what happens is the number of communication channels, the connections between individuals, is exponentially related to the number of people. Doubling the size of a group more than doubles the amount of communication lines between them. So if you look at this graph, you have a really big project with a relatively heavyweight process like Fedora's. My command line Twitter client has an effective development community of 0, but 1. And so it has a very lightweight process, which is basically, Ben did a thing, okay. Your project probably fits somewhere along that axis. And so when you think about it, think about what's appropriate for your community, for the volume of people and the work you're doing. So if you're developing this kind of process, what do you want to think about? Who should validate the change, check it out to make sure it's reasonable? Does release engineering need to be like, yep, we can do this? Do you have a legal person who's like, yep, that license is good, nope, we can't do that, we're going to get sued? Do you put it in front of the community for a general review? Who defines what the community is? How do they review it? And then separately, this is important, who approves the change? Because people can have input without actually being allowed to vote on it. So you could put it up to a community vote where everyone gets to say yes or no, and you take a majority vote, or you have 2/3 majority, or whatever. You can have some sort of technical steering body who is a small group of people that makes these kinds of decisions. You can have a single project leader who speaks with authority on all things, and they decide on their own what goes in and what stays out. So my opinion, and again, this is probably colored by this being what Fedora does, democracy is really messy. We may have learned over the years. And some people will only show up to complain, but then not actually make contributions to your community. And maybe that's okay with you, maybe it's not. But if you want to get decisions made in a reasonable-ish time frame, having an elected technical body to approve the changes is a good approach. Assuming your project is big enough to justify it. If there's 3 of you, you 3 can argue it out. If there's 300, you might want to have a few people who get elected every few months or every year or whatever, and they are the ones that votes on things. Because then and the elected part's important, because that still gives the community a vote. It becomes a representative democracy instead of just a straight democracy. And if your community doesn't like the direction that the technical body is taking it, they can vote them out. You don't have to do it this way. This is my opinion. Again, so some considerations you want to think about here is what happens if changes conflict. If you and I both say, I want to do this thing, but these things are mutually exclusive, who decides what goes forward or how that gets resolved? What happens if I make a change and it breaks something? Which would never happen. But if it did, who decides what to do about it? Who has the authority to back it out? And what happens if changes are undelivered? If I said, yep, I'm going to do this thing, and then I go off to the beach and disappear and never actually do it. Quality. Tests are good. It's good to have tests, preferably automated, because that people are expensive. We went back to, people have cost. But manual testing is important for some things and whatever. But more than that, you want to have some release criteria. You want to have, we must be able to do this, this, and this thing may not happen in order to release it. So you may have a criteria that says when the user upgrades, it will not remove all the data on their system and turn their computer into a giant molten pile of metal. People will appreciate that. And having release criteria can be helpful for building trust with your users, because they know that you've done at least some degree of validation. But it's also important to consider that not every bug can block the release, because otherwise you will never release. So you do want to have some way to sort of triage these important but not important enough to block bugs, and maybe prioritize getting those fixed first after the release. All right, so how do you do all this program management stuff that I've been talking about? And there's a lot more that isn't covered, because I only have so much time to cover a whole lot of different things. But for the time being, how do we do this? Communicate. 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 That's the core of my job. I send email, I receive email, I publish blog posts, I review blog posts, I attend meetings. One of the first things I did when I became the Fedora program manager So I made a list of all the meetings that are going on and tried to make it to almost all of them. At least once, just to wave my hand, say, "Hi, I'm here, I'm paying attention, I know you exist, come to me if you need help." And I am on a lot of mailing lists where I don't actually have any intention of ever doing anything in that part of the community, just because there's only so much I can do, or I just don't have the skills for that. But it's still important for me to know what's going on and to be able to spot issues and try and help people out. So there's a lot of listening that goes in. There's also a lot of talking, outward communication. So I do a weekly blog post where I say, here's all the stuff that's happened this week at sort of a high level. Here are the changes that were submitted, and here's some upcoming important meetings and conference deadlines and the scheduled milestones and all that stuff. I have regular office hours, which people almost never attend, but that's okay because sometimes they do and we talk about things, and the rest of the time, I'm there if they need me. But it's important to be available and visible to the community. And then also public issue trackers or Kanban boards or something, so that people can see what you're working on and they have a way of letting you know, hey, something's broken, I need help with this thing or whatever. So most of the things I've talked about here are just program management in general, whether it's corporate programs or community programs. So how is it different in communities? Well, like in companies, people don't really appreciate process and bureaucracy for the most part. They want us to be able to do their stuff and not have to worry about making sure they checked all the boxes and did the things and blah, blah, blah. Also, like in companies, you might not have any direct authority over the people who are working on stuff. And the job is really all about communication and coordination. So here's what's different. In communities, you can really only lead by influence. So it took me about 6 months before I was comfortable saying, no, go redo that because that's not what you need to do for this process. Before that, I was like, yeah, I'll help. I'll fix that up for you before I send it along. It's fine. And that's because it takes time to build credibility. And even though I'd been a contributor to Fedora for a long time, I was sort of off on the side a lot. I wasn't necessarily very visible. And people aren't going to listen to you just because you have a title. You need to establish that, yes, you know what you're talking about and you're going to be helpful and you're here to make things better. You have to show the community your value, because you can't go complain to somebody's manager when they're not doing the thing, because there's not a manager for them to complain to because they're doing this in their spare time. So the most important thing to remember, if you take away nothing else, is that whatever process you develop, the process is here to serve the community. The community is not here to serve the process. And if you find yourself trying to adjust the community to serve your process, that means your process is wrong. And so with that, we are out of time. So I will stick around for your questions, and I appreciate your attention. Once again, if you have nice things to say, there's my Twitter handle. If you have not nice things to say, you are cordially invited to keep those to yourself. Thank you very much.